Yes, exactly. That's exactly the same thing as other people. Can we relax with that? Don't you mind me asking?
I was banging my head. I mean, we were sat at the kitchen table. My daughter's revising for GCSEs, and I was trying to put my presentation together. Banging my head at the table, and she said, "That'll teach you what to do on the daily homework set." Yeah. Taking calls. Following you around there. Did you do presentations?
No,
Oh,
no,
no.
I didn't have a chance. So, yeah, my mum passed away Christmas Eve, so I'm a bit busy.
Oh. Is research and practice part of your...
Yeah. So I've got a project that I'm working on at the minute, which I'm looking to use. So it's just been half a stance by my son. So this morning he thought Mum had been kidnapped. Oh, and he wanted to call the police. It's humorous in one way, but it's just been a bit stressful doing how he's going through with it all.
Hey, how are you? Okay. Potentially
Yeah.
Quite squeeze, but I don't manage.
It's cozy.
I think last week every chair was taken.
Yeah. your message, sorry.
It's all right, they can't.
Do you still want to show the film?
If somebody has something to show you, is there
No.
Can I just perch on the table? Just don't.
I'll be alright, honestly, thank you.
is everybody else here?
Is there anyone?
Did you go check the
Table, my bag from down there. Oh, there you go. Okay.
slide record? Okay, so if everyone's here, we can start. My name is Mattia. I am taking the seminar to the capital. Probably you are already familiar with the notion of rhizome, but we'll go over it and look at it a bit in relation to Heidegger, which we looked at last week, and see what this concept can do. If you try to read it. When you read Heidegger, or when you had an introduction to Heidegger last week, one of the problems that he brings up in his work is putting the subject into a very difficult question, putting the subject in a position where there isn't a subject and then the word which hosts the subject, the individual. But the two happen together. And they constantly redefine each other in a relationship of trying to define what the relationship is and losing it and trying to find it and losing it and trying to find it and losing it. So it's a movement already. And every time this relationship takes place, this is really summing it up very quickly, Heidegger says it's an event. Something gains a distribution or a configuration in the form meaning. Now, this notion of event plus the subject that is put into question in such radical terms is picked up again in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, following a line of ideas and thought that develops from let's say after the war until the mid-60s. In the readings here for today, there was also the introduction to Anti-Oedipus, which is the first of these two books that they wrote. Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia is the first of the two volumes, written in 1974. And then in 1980, they wrote 1,000 Plateaus with the same subtitles, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, where they really go at the notion of subject with all the might they can apply, with all the weapons, with all the ideas, because their point of view, their departure is that in order to really avoid in any possible way the return of fascism, you have to do away with fascism inside yourself. The idea of a subject that applies self-repressions. And this is the convergence of two lines of thought, which is Marxism on one line and Freud in the other. Foucault in the introduction to Anti-Oedipus puts it in very elegant, almost ironical terms. One had to be within the lines of Marxism, never go too far away from Freud, stay within a certain accepted realm of like good manners and behavior in public. That was the way he puts it. And then he says around between 65 and 1970, especially on the point of 68, there is a return of these, which is not simply a return of these ideas, it's an eruption, it's an explosion. All of a sudden desire as the driving force comes to the fore and challenges absolutely everything. In culture, in society, in the work environment, in the arts. And this is much more than simply a reinterpretation of surrealism. It is something else, he says, that he finds very well expressed and very well put in the work of Deleuze and Guattari in these two major books. Now, what they try to do then to propose a completely different notion of subject, or better to put the subject in such a subject we articulate in a moment what it is, but let's stay with that. No, the identity of individual and the object individual relates to the to put it in problem entirely. They try to do away with any sort of pre-existing notion, any a priori notion, and instead they start borrowing from every field of science and knowledge and philosophy, trying to come up with a different solution, which they call the rhizome. But the whole idea of rhizome, the term technically is a form of multiplication of plants. We'll start looking at text in a minute because it's far richer than brief summary, but just to give you the idea. Heidegger had identified one of the problems of Western thought, which is reflected, I suppose, in art, in a very solid subject, I would say, the certainty of the subject, which you probably have seen with Johnny before from the carton. These problem of the solidity of the ground somewhere on which one roots certainty of an external world, which we know it's there, and we're in front of it, and we can point at it, and language can say it, art can depict it, and has to depict it. Before there was once a canon of beauty, and there are rules on how to present reality, the old perspective in modern painting from the Renaissance to the beginning of the 20th century. All these relate to the idea of a certainty of an external world. And art has actively participated in keeping this paradigm of thought alive and expanding. And Deleuze and Guattari come up with the idea that this system of thinking looks like a tree. It is rooted in the ground, the certainty of reality, and then grows in a line and constantly splits bilaterally of branches. And whether this model is directly a tree or it is presented in various first attempts at the beginning of the last century when Cubism happened or Joyce started writing, there is still the idea of an external unity somewhere, certainty that will keep it all together. They want to break even that apart and go further. And they present this other idea of rhizome, this model they apply, is an image they use, which instead is how plants that multiply themselves by spores create as a shape. There isn't a vertical line that splits up, but roots that grow up again further away and then further away, like weeds, like mushrooms, like the blackberries or the thorny bushes that grow wild in the countryside. They don't grow from a specific trunk, they come up everywhere. And they appropriate this idea as a model, or better, as a strategy or even a tactic. It's much more simple as a system, to develop another way of thinking. And they take it quite far ahead, because far away from this original point, because they would once they have broken the notion of the rise of the tree, they say that that idea of object as an identity, of reality and image, of author and artwork, that could be always, or was always, summed up in a formula that x plus y equals z, and creates a concluded totality, a word that one can define entirely. This is lost, or better, we actually got finally rid of it. This is the thing, to get rid of it entirely. And instead what we have is a string that has got no beginning or end, a sequence of things, a system of behaviors. If you think of the work of Yayoi Kusama, for example, who started in the 50s making gestural painting, repeating the same brushstroke until she created her own field. Then she went on making the funny shapes with the polka dots, but originally she started repeating the same gesture. And she repeats it in monochrome. There are big canvases. And that's exactly where it's very descriptive as an example, but it runs the idea of the same thing repeated, so that you insert a rhythm and it creates a pattern, and then it becomes a surface. And then you have the artist surface of the painting. Now, it can be as simple as that. It can be sets of behavior like how you come to this seminar, what you expect from this seminar to take place, what I am doing in my strength of behavior, and what I expect the seminar to be, and how the two things together create a specific situation which is rather unique. You can another group and another lecturer would have had a different result. They bring up an example which is quite interesting. They think of a flower and a bee, or a flower and a wasp, which create the reproduction system becoming one thing. So they say the wasp becomes part of the sexual organs or the bee of the flower, and vice versa. The flower becomes part of the feeding cycle of the insect. So there is these bits that are no longer all held all together, but participate with other groups, to other flows, and don't generate identities, but support them in moving. In terms of art, which I think is much more interesting than just thinking of it in abstract terms, the idea of not working with specific medium as a neutral support to produce an idea, but working with what lays at hand and see what you can do with it. I'm sure that you all have, whether it is the limitation of a technique or the fact that you don't want to have a technique and you don't even want to have a strategy, you only have the tactic to address what's around you and see what happens. If you think of the work of Francis Harris, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Belgian artist who lives in Mexico City. He has, especially in the 90s, worked extensively on the idea of how rumors spread. And obviously, or how information circulates without outside the technological environment. And one of the things he did was to cast in some cheap plaster various heads, various copies of the same head in different colors, and then threw them away. And then toured all the junk markets, old shops that would sell old things in the city for a year, trying to see what they would resurface. And some of them came back. So it was, what did he use? Well, he used the fact that there is a garbage collection system, that people go through the garbage to see if they can find interesting things, or things that they might resell because they need to make money. People then buy those objects and try to, and using all that was in place, he created an art. So he created an assemblage that went beyond just being a static assemblage. In the translation of the assemblage is a technical word that Deleuze and Guattari use a lot in his book around the notion of Rhizomes. But in French, it sounds something like agency, where things come together or intersect, and then at a certain point they enter a resonance and they move in sync, if you like. How does it happen that a demonstration is quiet and all of a sudden the riot breaks out? Sometimes the police charge without reason, but other times the crowd reaches a critical mass and moves into a new state. This is another form of assemblage, of agency. How does it happen that all of a sudden there is a burst of energy and Birmingham becomes the center of contemporary art? For a number of reasons, including the fact that London has become too expensive for artists. But you can put all these reasons together and nothing happens, or all the reasons can be co-present at the same time at the same speed, and something starts bubbling up and things change. This is what they are trying to tackle. This is what they really are after. So how can something hold together, be cohesive? That's another word they go after. Gain some sort of temporary mask or face or presence without being rooted in a ground of certainty, without being a solid identity that never moves. Because if you would revert to the logic of a solid identity, if you would revert to the logic of there is a subject and an object, there is a signifier and a signified, this dualism that has found plenty of interpretation that keeps always this idea, you're stuck. Because if there is a subject and an object, there is a signifier and a signified. The signified might as well be an essence. If you diverge from that essence, then you're wrong. You're wrong in terms of you cannot be gay, you're wrong in terms of your art is not art, so get a job and be silent. You're wrong, you can name it, but it's immediately, as soon as you lock something into a fixed essence, and therefore an image related to it cannot change, every sort of problem comes. And Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and all the movement that took place in those years, particularly in France, but not only, tries to develop a way of thought that will avoid this. Guattari, who wasn't a philosopher, wasn't directly an artist, was a psychiatrist and political activist, who came from the Lacanian school, but then went further and further away from that line of teaching, trying to create situations where to address what is called mental illness based on relations rather than cure. So there was another experimental psychiatrist in Italy called Basaglia who made a very important new model for addressing the so-called mental illness, the deviancy that is possible. So, and the two, they were working together in a lot of experiments, experimental models. One of the things they did was to do away with the idea of a mental institution, where the known normality is confined. And they created environments where what was the doctor or the psychiatrist and what was the mad person lived together, interacted together, worked together. So they completely broke down the hierarchy of normality that was complying with the correct model, in essence, called upstream, and what had sort of strolled off in the wrong direction and was no longer reflecting it properly. And Deleuze, on the other hand, on the other side, was coming from a line of studying philosophy, especially he was a philosophy historian, and always said that it's in the introduction of his book. He said that his idea was to take the history of philosophy in the most absurd possible way, so that yes, he would write history of philosophy, but in such a way that he says, I would take the piece of philosophy from behind and give them a monstrous child. He wanted to thwart it entirely, to try to break what had been at the core of the old modern paradigm. There is an absolute background, and we happen on that background, like the stage of theatre, which, if you like, reflects Newtonian physics. Time and space laid at the back, and everything, life, history, art, ideas, wars, happiness, whatever, all that's in front of it, but this background doesn't change. Science has challenged this quite a bit at the beginning of the last century, and throughout this, quantum physics, Einstein's complexity theory, all various things problematize very much the idea of a fixity, of something that is solid, eternal, and is the model. That's what they are trying to undo somehow. And in the notion of rhizome to them is the key to break these previous model. Am I making sense? Have you followed me so far? Now I think that this speaks a lot to art making. At least it did and does to me when I make art. Because it avoids entirely the idea that there are rules. If you want to sum up the notion of rhizome in very, very simple terms, the way it works, the rhizome isn't something. It's a mode of functioning. The way it works is that the only rule is that there are no rules. If you really want to boil it down to something that looks like a definition but cannot be a definition, it's already in itself a problem because it keeps changing. Often in art school one reads of Deleuze and Guattari the minor literature on Kafka. I don't know if you've ever come across it before. Where they speak a lot of metamorphosis and using things from inside to break up to break up a fixed model. But to move into the text, I would start with this idea in mind. To me, it's a very, very good thought image. A while ago, I was speaking with an electronic musician who makes instruments, and he had an amazing array of cables, buttons, plugs, speakers. It was fantastic, and he built it. And I couldn't really understand how it worked, but it was great. Aesthetically, it was, and we were talking about it. And then he said, an instrument is a set of limitations. In other words, he wasn't really that concerned with building a perfect instrument. He was concerned with putting some things together, see how these things would interact, and see what it could do with those interactions, and where repeating those interactions would take it, or would take the kind of music it would do. Now, anything is a set of limitations. The pencil is a set of limitations. You can draw with it, you can do plenty of shades with it, you can press or be lightly in your mark, you can change its colors, for example. Let alone you can make it play music. Or maybe you can. Depends. Certainly one has a violin. So everything is a set of limitations. It means that, and this is where going back to the idea of making art with what lays at hand and not thinking that an instrument can be a neutral vector to represent something. It leads to the fact that see what you can do with what you have. See what, and I'm not only talking about material instruments. You can appropriate or discuss a set of expectations, the kind of work I do. You can appropriate previous artworks. A lot of these fake imitations, pretending to imitate, reinterpreting, they're all reenacting scene. Plenty of all these of work that, as object, as material, does not have something tangible. That does effectively something tangible. And to approach these, the two of them write a book together, openly without a specific system. You will wake up in the morning, pick up a chapter or another one, a paragraph or another one, and just add something. So, and the book must be read not as a line from beginning to end, but diving in where you want, either following specific chapters which concentrate on a topic, or following transversal topics as you like. Again, do not follow the image of a tree as a beginning, rooted, and then develops into something else. I think that when one makes art is quite similar. I might be that it depends. It can become more subjective, but I never thought that one would say, "Oh, I want to do these," and then set off and make it. We might start with that idea, that doesn't work, and the 10 next attempts don't work, and they start varying, and then finally you get to something that takes you in a completely different direction, or considerably different direction, but it has become interesting. You have started developing the potential of the material and the ideas you were working on, which together kept finding different combinations, different distributions, different orders. And then they found their own dimensions. Does this ring a bell a bit more? Now, this is what we call a horizon. Horizon is something that keeps morphing. Is not an image of something else. The another description that they give of it is that its dimension are always n-1, the infinity of possibilities from which you actually objectify, concretize, to realize only one option. So it's infinity minus 1, that's the one that happens. It's not the idea that there are 3 dimensions plus time, or an ideology, or an idea of truth, whatsoever, that you have to represent. You're not representing beauty, there are canons for beauty. You're not representing the class struggle as much as Marxism wanted. You're not representing necessarily the problems of the unconscious as the Freudian or Lacanian school would want to do, or whatever, or now post-colonial issues directly. There is plenty of work like that. It's awfully boring. What's that? Yinka Shonibara, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with this work. It's a description of an idea. It doesn't go anywhere. Maybe you like that. I'm not offending anybody, but I find it what art it is not. There is no playfulness. There is no. It doesn't move. Doesn't evolve. And there is a lot of it. And it is exactly what I would call something that is a tree model. Because what can we take something that is simply mimicking an idea that is already there fixed? It's a mirror-like operation. I wouldn't have fun doing it. I certainly don't have any fun looking at it. And yeah, okay, I can't slug it, that's the only thing I do. So it's very limited, and they are trying to give us a tool instead to free the work of desire in much more radical way. And it's they start with the way they have written the book. Have you got the text? If does someone think to be I am quite bad at reading aloud after the first couple of lines. Someone want to read? Yeah. This is literally the beginning. If you start from here, we tried it here, but the other first.
Hold on to your hats. A book has neither object nor subject. It is made of variously formed matters in very different dates and speeds. To attribute the book to a subject is to overlook this working of matters and the exteriority of their relations. It is to fabricate a beneficent God, to explain geological movements. In a book, as in all things, there are lines of articulation or segmentality, strata and territories, but also lines of flight, movements of deterritorialization and destratification. Comparative rates of flow on these lines produce phenomena of relative slowness and viscosity, or, on the contrary, of acceleration and rupture. all this, lines and measurable speeds, constitutes an assemblage. A book is an assemblage of this kind, and as such is unattributable. It is a multiplicity, but we don't know yet what the multiple entails when it is no longer attributed. That is, after it has been elevated to the status of substantive.
Okay. It's very, very dense. First, I would draw your attention to book. Now, after starting off with this major project of changing radically Western philosophy, they speak about how they wrote the book. It seems rather reductive. Why? Then I start asking you what you think of it. But here, the book is both these specific set of pages, but also the notion of a book as an image of thought or an image of the world. Or better, they say the book has always been taken as an image of the thought or an image of the world. The book as a signifier of a signifier, a sign of a meaning. And therefore, writing a book like that would be to restate the idea of a linear way of thinking, of a thought that conforms to the tree model. There is a reality, and through the medium of language, which is absolutely transparent and doesn't have any creativity in itself whatsoever, I reproduce it. And here it is in 676 pages for this many pounds. And say, no, absolutely not. The book is a very, very complex object concept. It's an assemblage. And it is multiplicity. We'll get to assemblage and multiplicity, but I will stay with the notion of book. The book in this case is also philosophy, is also art, is also the discourse. What they are saying here is that, and even the subject, the individual, the book has neither object or subject. So it's not an I, as in the subject, voice that speaks of the object, of reality, of art, of its intentions, of its desires or emotion, or of the other subject in front of them. But it is made of, which is form of matters with very different dates and speeds. There are some things that are very, very old with us. Did you ever see LA Speaks Itself? Is it Speaks Itself? It's a strange documentary made out of, about Los Angeles. Made only with movies made in Los Angeles. The voiceover is rather annoying. I think it's Kevin Spacey. Not Kevin Spacey, sorry, it's something like that. It's a similar name. I'm horrible with names. He's an American actor. Doesn't matter. There is a moment in it where they quote LA Confidential. And they note that in LA Confidential, which is supposed to take place in the late 40s, very few things are from the late 40s. Everything else is from earlier. And they say they got it exactly right, because our reality is not made only out of January 24, 2013. Plenty of things are much older. Some 2 days older, some 3 years older, some 2,000 years older, and backward. So already the present is not a solid block. It is made out of segments that are much, much longer, much, much shorter. And on top of that, some of these segments moved very fast and others moved very, very slow. Things change at different speeds. We still have the idea. Architecture changes at a slower rate than fashion. Art changes at a different rate than the financial markets, and then they match up. And then when all these things are together, then we have a revolutionary moment or a completely critical moment for crisis like that of Phillips. So there are all these movements in this now symbolic object book, thought, image, artwork as well. And some accelerate, some slow down, some are so viscous and heavy that they act as gravity centers and they hold everything back. Others are actually breaking away their line of flight. That's another technical wording. I call it technical, just to be something that's important. They make up a lot of terms in this work. And in this case, the line of flight is something that from a solid identity, or a supposed solid identity, is moving in a different direction. Deleuze had written another book about logics, which is titled The Logic of Sense, based on Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, Aristotle, Glass. And he starts off a quote of Lewis Carroll, where he says, or makes Alice say, that one is always becoming bigger than one was and smaller than one is becoming, because Alice is changing size in the novel. So the idea that one is not, one becomes, is a state of constant flux. Does it make sense? It's a subtle thing, because if I say something is, then something is X. I have an equal sign in between two things, and then I could pretend that a photograph is a perfect reproduction of reality. I can pretend that a painting is a perfect reproduction of the intention of the artist, or of the ideas that had to be presented there, or that the novel is that the performance is exactly what the choreographer or the actors wanted to have. But if I'm thinking that something morphs, something becomes, this split is no longer possible. I have a number of things that are together and act together. I don't know what kind of, because I've never seen, I come here once a week for the PhD seminar, and I never tour the studio pitch. So I don't know what kind of works you do, but I believe that from the most, so between quotation, traditional to the wildest experiments, this idea of a representation is quite impossible to have. You know, we work in very different ways now. This ring a bell with you. I really think that it's important to bring it home to your work. Is anybody trying to, if you do, it's not wrong, but is anybody trying to contain the work so much that what you want is what comes out? Yeah. Or you interact with it? Yes?
It doesn't work for me at all, but what you've been talking about, is it just not process? Is it just a
Very good.
Just another word for it?
Very good, yes. Can you articulate it?
Just accidents, just things when I work. If I do have an idea in mind, if there's an exhibition, often that unfortunately funnels my expectations towards one thing. But if there's no end in sight, and I'm just narrow it down and play with the material and have accidents, and things become interesting, I'm shown to somebody else, then things just feed out. And that's, that was taught to me as process at art college, and then that's just become very important to me, process and play. That's a rhizomic way of working. Absolutely.
Does it make sense for everybody else?
I think there's always a danger that if you work full time, you think very hard about something in the small amount of time you have to make. The danger is you then make in that manner that you make the plan, which is a very, which I know personally is a very bad way of doing it. It's not what I want to be doing. So I think it's something I'm very aware of in terms of it's danger. It's somewhere you can go accidentally, but it isn't a very productive or useful place to go. But I accidentally sometimes fall in there.
I believe we all, yes.
I was thinking about the concept of short memory. They talk about that in the book. And isn't a painting or whatever, like short memory work? Shouldn't it be something like that?
In which way? I mean, it's not that there is one only interpretation of it. So.
I mean, you're saying that if, when you do an artwork, you are inside the context, so it can be influenced by something that is close to you, or an idea that comes in your mind.
Are we inside the context when we make? Probably yes, but not only. What do you mean by being inside the context?
Everything influences you. It can be so that can make you change in your work. That's what I understood from you as well.
Yes, I would put
But
it
you
like
can have
that.
an image in your. I mean.
Yes, absolutely. What these tactic of the rhizome goes much further than one thinks, because if you're right in saying we're always working inside the context, at the same time, the rhizome is not outside us. We are one of the movement, one of the vectors through it. The art piece, what we know about art history, what we have been discussing with the other artists we know, partners, what we've seen in the show yesterday, the show we hope to have in 3 months' time. All these things are different vectors that find distribution and create what they call a plane of consistency. Somehow they hang out and they get entangled like strings in the, or algae in the water floating about together. And they stay together for a while and they keep rearranging this. Everything one sort of moves out, or another one folds over 3 or 4 times in a different way and changes slightly the configuration. So yes, there is a context, but it is as partial as is the role of the author, the artist as a author, as the role of the art work, or the art history, or the so-called theory that we are reading. But this actually is an idea that to me is very, very important. We shouldn't consider this theory for art. This is just another idea that is crossing our minds today, which might be short memory, goes, might be long memory and stays, might be something that really challenges you and you want to reread it in depth and then see if it can inform the work in a much more direct way. It depends. But there isn't a theory for art, because for art, the distance between theory and practice is not given. What comes out of this argument is precisely this. If the book is not a tree book that is rooted in reality and has all these branches on the top that are the phenomena of the essence of the substance, then there is no point in saying, well, this is the pure code of your daily life. Your daily life is all there is. Does this make sense? Or is, well, no, there isn't a theory for making art. And rightly so. We had a discussion with Dane once, a couple of comments, but I was saying, well, art always had an history and a criticism. It doesn't have a theory. And the fact that progressively there is the idea that we could have art theory somehow suffocates the creativity. Because it's not that art doesn't need theory. Art has its own theory. It's the practice. Art, whether you work with images or acts or expectation or even with text, you're not using that. You don't need a transparent description that says what you're doing. What you're doing is what you're doing. It's that. It is a rhizomatic way of acting, of being. And what the rest of Guattari are criticizing is precisely the idea that you can split this moment in two. A signified and a signified, an image and an essence, the text and the content of the text. Maybe if the manual of the TV might work like that, the theory of how to use it, up to the point, I don't understand. But beyond it, even this is a practice in itself, it's not theory. It's very important to look at it like this, because then, and this is exactly what they're saying when they say, two of us wrote Anti-Oedipus together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. Here we have made use of everything that came within range, that was closest as well as further away. And then it goes on, and and it says, what is it? We work in this manner, and we speak like everybody else to say, because it's nice to. Sorry, I've lost my. There was a crowd because there is several inside. The other. So the identity. Oh yeah. And what is to reach the point? To reach not the point where one no longer says I, but the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says I. We are no longer ourselves. Each will know his own. We have been aided, inspired, multiplied. And then he goes on to the book
It's about hallucination as well.
Actually, they did a lot of drugs. Both these things. No, they also said it.
It makes a difference between psychoanalysis and schizophrenia.
Absolutely.
Which is, I think, makes a difference maybe between a rhizome and a tree as well.
Yes. Can you say a bit more about it? It's very
Well,
good.
it's again about the context, I think, and the pragmatism that it's the base of schizophrenia, while the psychoanalysis is more like reasoning from main points from a general, and then analyzing in a deductive way. I think. But schizophrenia goes more in the context; it's more pragmatic.
Well, I don't know enough about psychoanalysis proper. I mean, in the clinical environment to give a proper distinction. But my understanding is that schizophrenia is seen as one of, between quotation, illnesses that psychoanalysis is like to correct, again, between quotations. What they are saying is that psychoanalysis does nothing else but reinforcing a paradigm or a political game of closing down the subject. The whole notion of the Oedipus concept of frustration, that they applying these, say, well, you're all frustrated, try to get to live with it, we try to correct it a bit, but frustration is there, you cannot get rid of it. And one of the intentions of the rhizomatic approach is to say, well, the frustration can be dealt with entirely, and you can be happy desire flowing freely. It was written in the 70s also to keep this. Since you were speaking about context, sorry, is part of it. The way they do appropriate the idea of schizophrenia is that precisely because they don't want the subject to be a closed, singular identity, completely concluded, then they think of this condition where one feels like many. They've been criticized a lot for this because obviously someone who really suffers of schizophrenia suffers. And it must not be a nice place to be, to feel sudden voices that happen to be sudden. But it's they use it as many other words or concepts, a bit as images, not metaphors, but images. Even the rhizome itself is an image. They borrow from botanical, technological terminology. And actually the whole book is like that. But borrowing from, the references section is immense because they went everywhere. They probably sat in the library just picking a book up and opening up, what can we use of it? Which is a very artistic way of doing things. But which is a rhizomatic way of doing things. Does it fit? Can we plug it in somehow? No, it doesn't. What do you want plugged in? By chance. Keep it. Obviously, they are also one of the vectors, as the so-called artist is one of the vectors in the art piece. But it comes together, yes, in a schizophrenic way. But if we say that now, schizophrenic way, it sounds negative. They put schizophrenia as a positive element because they want to put forward the notion of something that is together as multiplicity. What you read before, the last line, here. The book is an assemblage of this kind, and as such it is unattributable. It is multiplicity, but we don't know yet what the multiple entails when it is no longer attributed. that is, after it has been elevated to the status of substantive, they go on later on, there is a paragraph about not saying multiple, but multiplicity. Because they say, if we say multiple, we say that something, one thing, is multiple, but the one thing remains, is the outside shell of it. Multiplicity is like uncontained, is a co-presence of various things that finds temporarily a movement in sync. Around this time, a bit earlier, another French philosopher wrote, wrote something. He was an heterodox Marxist. He also went mad. But he described the revolution as the moment when or where various lines in society reach their critical state at the same time. An economic crisis, a strong union or working class movement, a big social divide, a lot of idea regarding class and social change circulating in society. They all peak at the same time. It's a sort of general orgasm. And I'm not saying this just to make an example. It is part of this frame, this atmosphere of thinking that desire, sexuality should be opened up far more than playing reproduction games or just sexual games. It's everywhere. So I describe revolution in these terms. And whatever is playing reaches the peak at the same time. And then things change. Interestingly though, to go on from this point, Deleuze and Guattari, instead of thinking of climax when they speak of the horizon, they speak of plateau, which is again another sexual term. The reaching of a level of pleasure that doesn't reach the peak, but continues flat somehow. And when they speak flat, they use the word flat. And when they say that, they speak of flatness. They mean that whatever it is that has come together, stays together for a certain period of time. And then things start moving again in their own direction. You seem a bit skeptical. And this is why they use the expression plateau. And actually, it's interesting because they borrow it from some anthropologists who studied the Balinese behavior in something. So they drew this thing in from a completely different environment. And it works. It plugs into what they're trying to say, and it adds meaning to it. It becomes another dimension to what they're doing. If you like, I at times work in photography, and I think that in this case it becomes interesting to bring it in. The frame, wherever you put a frame on, you can have a photograph, even if you don't have a camera, and you put a frame around something. Maybe even painting might work like that, although there is much more activity. But directing attention is similar to this framing something. And wherever you're doing that, then what's inside has its own balance or unbalance and number of things, number of dimensions. These don't have to be the same each time you sort of fix the frame. They are saying exactly the same about rhizomes. Every time there is a cohesion, every time the mixing of things reaches a plateau that creates some sort of reality that holds these things together. A number of dimensions are appearing, but they don't have to be the same dimension as the previous time or of the next one. In a piece of work you make, you don't have the same dimensions of the piece of work of another artist, another student here in school, or maybe even a previous piece of work you made. You don't have the same elements all the time participating to it. And by elements I include your ideas, your mood that day, what you were thinking, what you were trying to do, what you were trying not to do. All these things are different elements that participate in creating the plateau, or even the flat image, if you are making flat images, it doesn't have to be flat image. There is something of that sort. So, this is why I drew so much attention to this description of the book. They take the book as method. The way they write the book is the concept they are trying to pass. And they go on later in the famous 73 pages about it, saying that a plateau is always flat. A rhizome is always flat. Doesn't mean it's limited, but you cannot step out of it and point to it saying this is X. It's inside. You live inside it. In other works, they speak of surfaces, which are very rich in their own folds, but you can't step away and point at them, naming them, which is famous. But it's the game of philosophy, the game of the Western discourse. Stepping out as a subject, pointing and naming at the object. The name of all the semiotic-like language that we're doing. Barthes, in the book there, plays this role as one of the most prominent. The vice versa, the rhizome is always inclusive. One is always one of the dimensions of the rhizome. There isn't a way to step out of the book vertically. To them, as soon as you start reading the book, you become part of the rhizome of the book as well. So the notion of multiplicity is really this thing that keeps together everything that enters in this gravitational force can be attracted by it, and once it's attracted, it's part of that field. An art piece by itself would mean nothing. And I carefully said, I didn't say it would have no meaning. It would mean nothing. It would not be active. You need your baggage of intentions and knowledge and attempts, and the same plus more of whoever else interacts with it, so that the passage, the distribution that these three or more points make, the author-authors, now it's very common to work as a collective as they do, is part of it. Then there is the work, and then whoever acts as public, as participants, willing, knowing of being a participant or not as well. All these creates the field that is the meaning of the artwork. And some of you work with other people, either collectively or participation-based projects, rational aesthetic kind of things. No. You're making things. It's rather similar, but even if you make things, even throughout the last 30 years or 40 years, there was a sort of casting things in bronze was the worst you could do. Because it was exactly making a plan, following through a specific process that was supposed to have no effect on what you did, and then finally have this object quite separated from you, immutable, put that on the shelf and admire it. And there is a famous quote of Yoko Ono, I once saw a show from the work at retrospective, and in the end she does make some bronze pieces in her late years. And she says, well, I thought in the end the bronze was alright, yes. Actually what she makes with bronze is not, it makes sense, it's not any bronze casting, but even in that case, I've never worked with bronze. I spent quite a bit in the foundry early on, working for another artist. It's not true that it's a neutral process. At all, as it's not true the watercolor is a neutral process. The problem is that the paradigm, the cultural paradigm, proposes it to us. And it's quite difficult in the end, even if you use it all the time, to stand up to the discourse that tells us that what we are doing is expressing a meaning. So the expression and the meaning are two different things. Deleuze and Guattari say to us, no, the expression and the meaning are the same thing, because as you said before, it is process. There is another quote somewhere where he speaks on... I did put on my yellow stickers here, but I didn't know I can find it. Anyway, I can describe it. He speaks of, they make the example of the puppet with the strings. And they say, well, that's sort of an entanglement of strings. So this is, but there isn't an artist, an agency up on the balcony that makes it move. What these relate, what the puppet and the strings relate to is just another puppet with other strings, because all the nervous system and then up in the nervous system, all the synapses that connect the brain, and the chemistry and the electricity that goes on in all those exchanges are nothing but more strings, more connection, and then in the end you find nothing at the output. So it's a continuous sequence of processes that are applied to other processes, that are applied to other processes, that are applied to other processes. That's what also a rhizome is. The psychoanalysis which are criticizing already have done away with the notion of a soul. This is why the church rejected psychoanalysis for quite a while and still sees it as very problematic. But they go even further. The whole idea of there is something, although it's unreachable, that the Lacanian discourse would like to have, and happens only in language. So there is a mirroring of some sort. For them, is still a dualism. They go further. And they really try to break away with this notion of dualism, of an image and its content, an image and its meaning. Because if you think of dualism, and it is very, very strong in the Lacanian discourse, which they are actively opposing, you have always something and the order of something. Famously, this has generated a lot of problems with the feminist movement. The whole discourse of Lacan somehow I generalize it because I don't know it in depth, but proposes woman as the order of man, the order sex. Rightly so, was bigger as. But art becomes the order of language. As in language is the center, and art is in reference to visual, sensual practices, whether one sings or makes images or does performances while cooking and distributing food in the street, it doesn't matter. It's the order of this linear, clear way of thinking. And they are rejecting that. So much that they would really try to push it forward. Would you think that when you make a piece, there is the opposite of what you're making? Is there such a thing as the opposite of an art piece? Yes, you think?
Oh, it's in quite an obvious way. I work downstairs with students and I help them make moulds, and they constantly disregard the moulds as objects and maybe pieces of art because they only want what comes from it, and they don't actually consider that whole process sometimes that they've been through. That is also part of what they've made, but it's just discarded, and sometimes I think they're more interesting than the actual objects that
and
they
what
make.
If, I agree with you, but what if, I believe this is common to everybody, whatever you're doing, we like spending time with what we're doing, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. What if the real point of art is actually that time we are spending with what we're doing, rather than the final separated thing that maybe we go to a gallery, maybe we appreciate other people, maybe we exhibited or seen, experienced somehow somewhere. That that would be a very different way than thinking that the practices, the creative practices of art are the order of language. They are of their own, in their own. For us, no, we are in our own when we're making that. It's a place. It's a place that is a place and a discourse at the same time. It does not need an external justification. It's part of their argument that it comes from more mainstream psychoanalysis that precisely that time that one spends making art is the work of desire. Desire wants to keep imagining it, wants to keep being active, otherwise one literally goes mad. And it's not the final casting, that is the process that one enjoys. That's what happens in the dream work, that's described by Freud as well. And in this case, they are pushing it forward, pushing it even further, saying precisely that that moment, or span of time, that afternoon or weeks or months working with something, on an idea, trying to pursue it and reaching it or never reaching it and making more of it and trying to gain a fantastic space when you're in the studio, with the music, without the music, alone or with it, doesn't matter. That's the pleasure, that's the satisfaction, that's the art, that's the rhizome, because it's keeping together all these things, then break away.
Isn't in that sort of visual analogy the art the thing that sticks itself up above the ground and has leaves and grows and does the other bit is a mare's tail or a mushroom or whatever it might be?
The rhizomatic thing that...
The rhizomatic thing underneath is the supportive structure and the building structure and the growing structure and the thing that contains and generates the energy. Mm-hmm. But what a rhizomatic plant does in the end is pop something up above the ground.
Yes, but it is also... What they are saying is precisely that you cannot separate the two. You cannot separate the roots,
no,
which you don't see the essence. Which
but isn't in some ways that's what the artist is, the bit that pops up?
I see what you're saying, but it is a risky way of describing it, because if we keep with the image of plants, if you put it, after the idea of something that blossom,
always the bit that's is maybe more, a public or shared or known or visual.
Like the actual mushroom, and you've got the filaments under
the ground. Yeah. So it's it's the bit that's more obviously there, when actually all the other stuff is the stuff that gives it energy and builds it and creates it and supports it.
How do you see this or hear this?
I come back to that bit when you were saying what is an opposite to is what you make the opposite, and it feels like it's the -1 bit from infinity. You make the -1 bit, and there's infinity left that could have been made, that could have been done, and so there's all the possibilities that could spring up anywhere, but you're just the one, and that one thing that you followed has been the root of everything else. Maybe the rest of the universe, I don't know, coming together, and that's the thing.
Yeah, there's a finite number of those multiplicities and dimensions that all interlink and form together, and we all are associated in one way or another, but then we also have our own individual finite sense as well.
Yes, absolutely. There are two different moments in the argument that they are making, but it is correct. And indeed they are saying it, they are mentioning this later on, and they are saying you can break a rhizome apart. Absolutely. You can, but what happens, we just find smaller bits that work precisely the same way. So yes, we can break apart the whole distribution of the art system, and then the local exhibition spaces, and then the art school here in Margaret Street, and then us, and then you individuals, each of us, including myself, and we exist separated from that in a certain way as well. And inside each of these spheres that are going down, like a Chinese dog, there is more of the same game. You are as an individual with your story, your memories, your family, friends and things, and then you can break down your private life, like when you go home, there is also that more that is still built of various layers, intricated and put together. Indeed, to bring your two comments together and maybe try to answer you. It's a bit of an acrobatic joke. If we go to the other bit that was there today, the idea of refrain, the other chapter in the book, they speak of rhythms. And they speak of rhythms as something that creates space and time. The first they start the chapter saying, a child in the dark, gripped with fear, comforts himself by singing under his breath. He walks and holds to his song. Lost, he takes shelter or orient himself with his little song as best as he can. The song is like a rough sketch of calming and stabilizing, calm and stable, centered at the heart of chaos. And then they add as well, but the song itself is already a skip. It jumped from chaos to the beginning of order. In chaos and sorry, I told you I couldn't read properly. But the song itself is already a skip. It jumps from chaos to the beginnings of order. To the beginning of order in chaos, and is in danger of breaking apart at any moment. Then they go on and add, now we are at home, but home does not pre-exist. It was necessary to draw a circle around that uncertain and fragile center that organized a limited space. And then there is a third step, but the idea of the darkness and the child is afraid, the darkness, you see nothing, you could be completely alone. And the child sings a song, create a pattern, a rhythm, to feel more comfortable, to feel at home. And that rhythm creates order, so creates something that has dimension, something that is readable, or something that speaks, out of chaos, out of that infinity you rightly so remembered. They are drawing here very heavily from some work on complexity theory and thermodynamics of Russian physicist called Prigozhin. But the concept is that in something that is undetermined, like chaos or infinity, where all options are possible, so you might as well have no option. It doesn't make any difference. Something starts moving and moves with a repetition pattern, repeats itself, creates a shape, creates a space. It starts fixing something and then moving things in relation to it. If, again, bringing these home for us, if you are not working with a specific technique, or even so, maybe, you start a new cycle of work, and you are in the studio or wherever you work, and you start looking around. And so, if you are painting, you might think, what am I painting next? I've been doing the same thing for too long now. If you are working with cultural expectations, like I do, you go around and observe what is being done by other artists and what you see in the street and in the media and the news, until something becomes like heavier than the rest. So there is that and then the rest. There is that and what you did before. And it creates movement, but mostly creates a distribution. Some things acquire more weight, other less. You make a sketch, you make another sketch, you make a third sketch. At the fifth sketch or the 50th sketch, you find that there are 3 lines that repeat themselves and you find them interesting. So that has become your reference point, and then you move on from there. This is what they are after here. And this is something that, the reason why I mentioned the Prigogine and his scientific research was just to show that I remember it. But they are referring to a new move mostly in physics and biology that sees that the whole universe develops in this way. Whether it is cells repeating or subatomic particles organizing themselves, or economics, or movements of clouds, or school of fish, it doesn't matter. These rules of self-affinity, repetition, and establishing of this repetition as a dimension of the space it is creating is the basic law. What is very interesting to them about this basic law of repetition is that it is heterogeneous. It's not the same law. It's not the same kind of repetition. Each time it will be a different one. We are not behaving in the same way or exactly in the same way with different people. There is a pattern that is established between you and a friend, you and a partner, you and a family member, you and a lecturer in school when you are 10 and you and a lecturer in school in this environment, you and an employee, or whatever. Because the back and forth of the repetition varies, and actually it is generative, it is creative. What they are trying to put forward here is that it is precisely the fact that there isn't an order of things, and then things start interacting and they gain an order and they gain a meaning. There is a blank canvas which means nothing, as I was saying before, and then your interaction with it finds a dynamic relationship and builds a meaning. If you think of how the history of painting unfolded from the beginning of from so-called contemporary art, the historic avant-garde, Cubism, analytic Cubism, return to order, the problems of, then after the war, you have the abstract expressionism, figure and background fade off entirely, Pollock and all the group in New York, and at the same time, the same problem taken on in Milan, in Italy by Lucio Fontana. He cuts the canvas. He's trying to find a different relationship, and obviously the concern was, the same concern that Duchamp had, how can you represent 3D in 2D? And Duchamp went on with all his funny paintings and then simply questioned what was the art object. But the problem remained, and because it was so rich that it had to be articulated throughout the century, and to the point it arrives to this famous cut done in 1962, 1961, to respond to the artist expressionism, which, yes, had already flattened the difference between figure, the subject, the art, and the background, the space, but they wanted to do more. So it was a matter of finding a relationship. It was not there before. This is why I think that these ideas that I'm putting out are very useful for art, because they allow some artists to reclaim the legitimacy of what we are doing based on what we are doing. Too often, otherwise, one is complying with criticism, the discourse of criticism, the discourse of curatorship. There is so much that comes upon. Cultural theories are suffocating what we are doing with so much that it's not wrong in itself, it's not unimportant. But art does not need that to be explained, because you don't need to explain it. Art works according to its own rules, logics, and dimensions. There is otherwise there is. We are delivering all of our autonomy, legitimacy, power to the authority of discourse, of text. It's the rule saying that everything that is written rules and the rest doesn't. It's always less important. The tree, again, that they're criticizing so much. And this is why they write the book in the way they write it, as a funny assemblage of things. The more you read through it, the more you realize that there are things that they shouldn't be there, or if they are there, you should read them as part of a different book, or you can disregard them entirely and skip through a few paragraphs until they are saying something of substance again, because they are bringing in a bit of everything. But then the next time you read it, that does seem of substance the first time doesn't speak to you the same way, because you're following a different strand through it. So the very notion of substance here would be extremely problematic. Substance has the essence of something that you can finally grab and grasp, and you have it, and that's it. The famous ball that has no meaning that keeps coming around there. Johnny loves that. So the game of these rhythms is what you can see them as frequencies, waves. A different wave pattern has a different sound. The waves can enter in resonance. Some resonances break down architecture because they're vibrating the wrong way. Other resonances again make a place in cultural ferment, and great things happen. It very much depends on how they combine themselves and how many of it. And as soon as a new one enters, the thing rearranges itself in order to accommodate it. But not because there is an overall intelligence that plays it, it's simply because it plugs in and the things start behaving in a different way. From these you can draw all the ideology of ecology, sustainable planet, all these things come exactly from that, the idea of a balance. But the idea of a balance is not because the balance in itself is positive, and vice versa. It's that things are always in balance. The balance is also a planet completely consumed that has reached anthropic death and is sort of lukewarm with no energy to use anymore, and no cold water, no hot water, not just still. That's a balance. What they are saying is that actually, though, there are constantly moves and movement that are going off in different directions, so you never reach that static dead end. You still following me? There was another thing that is worth reading. You still have time? Yes, I remember. Yes, it might be. From here to find an okay of it. I think you can stop on first.
From chaos, milieu, and rhythms above. This is the concern of very ancient cosmogonies. Chaos is not without its own directional components, which are its own ecstasies. We have seen elsewhere how all kinds of milieus, each defined by components, slide in relation to one another, over one another. Every milieu is vibratory, in other words, a block of space-time constituted by the periodic repetition of components. Thus, the living thing has an exterior milieu, materials, an interior milieu, composing elements and composed substances, an intermediary milieu, membranes and limits, and an annexed milieu of energy sources and actions, perceptions. Every milieu is coded, a code being defined by periodic repetition. And each code is in a perpetual state of transcoding or transduction. Transcoding or transduction is the manner in which one milieu serves as the basis for another, or conversely is established atop another milieu, dissipates in it or is constituted in it. The notion of milieu is not unitary. Not only does the living thing continually pass from one milieu to another, but the milieu pass into one another. They are essentially communicating.
No, they use here a number of. It's very dense passage. Can you follow when you read, or you just hear your voice with no?
Yeah,
I'm. Okay.
Can't do two things at once.
they use here, they said that the milieu is coded, or better, creates a code. And then later on, they will speak of the code being expressive. And they start building, sometimes the terminology that they create is quite complicated, varied. What they mean is that in the vibrations, in the repetitions of a rhythm, there is some sort of dimensionality, some sort of, indeed actually, without saying some sort of, there is a block of space-time that is constituted here. Every milieu is vibratory. In other words, a block of space-time is constituted by the periodic repetition of the components. Now, a block of space-time is a place. It could be now in Birmingham today, or it could be beginning of the 21st century, whatever you want to think as an example. And then they say these becomes expressive. They use the expression territorializes, becomes a territory, acquires meaning, but somehow decays into something that is more static. And they go on for a while speaking about the territory is constituted by all the distribution of things that happen in this rhythm. And how the territory is made by distances between the peaks of the wave, or the position one takes in this rhythm, and the others, and all these things that we've been discussing before about how a horizon comes together and becomes a plateau. But then they say, this is not, then all of a sudden they say, well, we said enough bad things, about negative things about a territory. And it sort of takes you a bit by surprise. Because they say, what happens in the territory? What is very interesting is that at the same time as it is somehow decaying, coming down, becoming solid, becoming less and less mobile, less and less multiplicity and more identity, something inside it escapes sideways and moves toward a new configuration. And that they call deterritorialization. It doesn't matter what you remember the term. This movement that is continuously, and or better, simultaneously, of converging on an identity, converging on a meaning, converging on a place, converging on a moment that has a feeling, a color. You think, well, actually, these last few years in Britain have been rather dull. It's not like the late 90s where art was exploding and everything sounded and felt so exciting. Or, well, probably the West at the moment is in decline. There isn't much we are able to say and do. We should move to Beijing if we want to make artists and see there the film. Even if we did, we wouldn't be Chinese, so we wouldn't have the energy that comes from that place because the novelty is there, if it is there. So this could be the feeling that is set by this territorializing of the vibration. And vice versa, something else is moving out of it. Whether it is this simple fact that we are reacting to it as artists, we are tackling the fact that the West is indeed in decline, and how we are exploring this new situation. We've been at the center for 5-6 centuries, if not more. Or something entirely different. This simultaneous movement interests them a lot, and goes back to your comment earlier about the process that takes you sideways.
Surely if you're deterritorialising, then you've got to re-territorialise again. That happens at the same time.
Yes, continuously. And they also add that it happens in more than 2 ways at the same time. And you can deterritorialize it in various directions. Again, you can reach the level of schizophrenia, which is, let's keep it literally and not real, but it's that threshold of experimentation when you let things flow and some time you don't let things flow. You flow with things because the wave is too powerful. And sometimes it's very good to let oneself be carried by it in creativity or in life in some moments. In other moments, it's more difficult, it's even scary. And sometimes you can decide not to float with it, sometimes you can't, and you've got to get it on. But what they are trying to put forward here is that the repetitions, the rhythms that generate dimension, generate place, by place I mean a space and a discourse at the same time, space and its meaning, space and what's supposed to be, will be in the end, if the territorialization succeeds entirely, splits the two apart, and there is the place and its image separate, the place and its discourse, and we go back to a semiotic model. While this happens, simultaneously something moves out of it. Maybe the very material that is supporting the image as a meaning, maybe something else, something in between, and they actually do mark the word in between very much. They go and say milieux are open to chaos, which threatens them with exhaustion and intrusion. Rhythm is milieu's answers to chaos. What chaos and rhythm have in common is the in-between, between two milieus, rhythm and chaos, the chaosmos, between night and day. So, in other words, what they are saying about the rhizome is that it is a finite moment. It has reached the level of plateauing where it stays together. Your art piece, whether, no, it doesn't matter that you have plenty of ideas, emotions, memories going through you, and it happens in an environment of culture with expectations and memories and history. In the end, something, bronze or not, that comes out and stays. Or if it is ephemeral, at least as a final version of itself. But while that remains there, so it cannot, I wouldn't say it falls by the wayside, but somehow decays from this flux of energy and becomes more solid and static. But plenty of other things instead keep moving. And you keep putting out, or we keep putting out, not only artists, to them it's like in general, putting out these. They become products, but they were not started as products. They were started as that enjoyable time we spent making.
The ideas.
Might be ideas, but it's, you say no, you say ideas, yes.
Yeah. I don't know, it's just sort of like we constantly evolve when we move out. I mean, it's like when you look at the internet and things like that, and we've got lots of sort of, it's like transformation that happens all the time when people move out. And it's sort of like lots of multiplicities of these going on. But in some way, we're constantly overturning the sort of ready-made codes and structures that we have in place, and we move forward again and break those codes, and then that happens again. So we're constantly transforming.
Yeah.
Which is what we do when we create our artwork.
Just on that point about the internet, I was thinking that the whole time, the internet seemed to be what fits in best with this. They seem to be quite prophetic in their sort of prediction of the internet, really. And the fact that the book would be better probably presented in an internet kind of a way. And these plateaus that you talk about, the plateaus seem to be websites and blogs and so on, and the gatherings around these areas, and things changing, and the way it's looking and so on. I don't know whether that's right or not, but that's just the way.
I don't believe you can speak of right or wrong in this environment, but it does ring a very loud bell, absolutely. I would take it even further than that. This speaks a lot to the abstract argument around the internet, which is the old network theory, so-called. But network theory, or this some part of it, thinks that. Sorry, let me rephrase it. This allows us to think of networks not as funny shaped trees. Networks are not the connection of all these machines only. Networks are things that can create new links according to the possibilities that are there in the specific terms of their connections that were not thought of when the previous link was designed. I will try to unpack this. When the internet started, nobody envisioned Facebook or Twitter, just to name two major phenomena of it. And then even when websites started, they weren't yet implicit in the web. And probably even when they were designed as such, the first Facebook bits, they would never have thought not only of the size it would become, but that they could plug in, is it Instagram that is part of it now, and then they buying each other and become such huge economies, and then it could be used for consumerism on one side, for communication in political activism on the other side in different situations. These are possibilities that at a certain point somebody recognized in something that was available there, but they were not planned. They could arise, but they were not planned. They were not implicit. In this movement of the rhizome, the notion of cause-effect, the linear cause-effect of a traditional science, breaks down. The way we enter that space-time of making art abandons this idea of I have an intention, I'll make it happen. And this is the technique to make it happen. There are endless ways of describing it, from trial and error to experimentation to whatever, doesn't matter what you call it, but the determinism is broken. Does it make sense? I often use my old phone for this because it's a very good example. This phone is a digital representation of a traditional telephone. It does exactly what an old phone did, plus text, okay? But because it's digital, it has in itself, in itself it had nothing. In itself it was a copy of a normal phone. But somebody saw that digital could do something else. And 12 years later, it has become the iPhone 6 or whatever, or a smartphone, which is much more than simply a phone. It is a place of entertainment, information, is your calendar, whatever, your music, the map. So something has started, while the line or the notion of the traditional phone with the number, remember those, kept converging on this one. This one was already moving off transversally towards the super fancy things that I never buy because they cost too much. But and you're very good in bringing up this because it's still valid, absolutely. It speaks to the web and it is this constantly launching. When something closes down, something else moves on. And sometimes, let's not be absolutely clear. Sometimes things close down and then some technologies don't develop. They become dead ends. Some ways of working become dead ends. Or, and I'm thinking here there is a huge printing shop with very old-fashioned printing machines. They move from being tools of trade and commerce to being used in a completely different way for an experimentation, for artistic purposes, as photography changed painting. Because instead of the first reaction to photography was, it's a trick. It takes so much craft to make a painting of reality, and now they can press a button, they rotate the picture, it's worth nothing. But what it did in reality was freeing painting from the task of reproducing reality, depicting reality. So you could explore what the meaning of this flat, two-dimensional plus color was. And then photography actually developed as something that is a craft in itself, and then becomes a discourse. And now the same is happening with digital. There's another split. Digital has picked up the idea of doing what photography has done, but faster and better. So now you have pieces of software that recognize if a face is smiling in some cameras, telling you what's a good photograph, for example. Who has decided that? It's not the software, there is some bureaucrat upstream that has decided. And there is a lot of experimentation again with analog photography with film. Polaroid went bust and shut down, but the employees of Polaroid have joined together, created a cooperative, and they are now making Polaroid-like film called Project Impossible. Also, it's impossible to use; it doesn't work very well. But that technology has moved into an artistic experimentation field. So you have these continuous movements, and these are not binary splits, because other things have died off, and other things return or persist, but they are not particularly interesting. In Tuscany, in Carrara, there is still marble carving as a la Renaissance, so to speak, in the same way, but it's not interesting. It doesn't speak to us now. I don't know who buys those little Venices standing there. But they still make them because there is a market for it, but it's not as meaningful as other artistic experiments. And what they're after here is instead is precisely to understand how this movement happens. And I think it is of the various authors one ends up reading in an art school, they are the most fashionable, certainly, and the most inflated in usage. But it's this concept of closing down and opening up, of something that comes together with a multiplicity of dimensions that are never necessarily the same as before or the next one, speaks to artistic practices very directly. At least this is what I always found in my experience. And I would add another thing to this. Now, when they speak of a rhythm, they make there is a problem of translation here, but they go to they want to make clear that the rhythm is not a meter. In other words, because they use the word unit in French. I don't know if you're familiar with, in this case they refer a lot to music as the example of the logic they're using, but then they spread it out. Some Middle Eastern music, Turkish, Balkanic music, does not use note system. Doesn't have 7 notes and 3 octaves or whatever they are, as we have in the classic system. But has sequences of sounds. And I believe the standard, there are 47 different sequences. And then you play with those. Like the same thing happens in jazz. You have a little pattern, and then you elaborate, articulate on that pattern, and then you plug it into another pattern, and then into another pattern. And that's the way you build the music. This is why, for example, early jazz players did not know how to read music. Not only because they were coming from black slums in America and never learned how to read or write, and they were just playing the instrument. That's the naive story, is that jazz music does not need to be written because it picks up a pattern and elaborates on the pattern. They are pointing out this thing here by saying a rhythm is not a meter. The unit of a rhythm is a string, is a bit that already has a distribution within itself. It has a way of behaving. The meter refers to an absolute background or an element, a unit of reference, which then you apply. And of these 10 centimeters, there are 27 in this animal or in this painting, which makes the painting 270 centimeters long. That's what the meter is. Well, that's the tempo of the meter of the music. Tick tock, and then you comply with it. Is the canon, John has got this thing here, that forces whatever shape you make within specific dimensions and proportions. And, you know, the Greeks had the idea of canon was such in ancient Greece that there was a paradoxical idea that you could carve the left half of a statue in one city and the right half in another city and bring them together, it will match perfectly because the camera will dictate precisely and exactly how to make a shape according to an idea of beauty, pure and abstract, that was somewhere up in the end. They're saying that the way of working is exactly the opposite. You pick up something that is moving, it's of interest, the fact that you can take a photograph, the fact that you can be an artist, and then what do you take it? I can be an artist, I've got nothing, an empty studio, there is art history, and you have Bruce Nauman spitting water and acting as a fountain, mimicking the sound. And so forth. These things, you take a strand and you put it into action, and you plug it into something else. So there is movement, but yes, it does territorialize, but it never there is nothing static to refer to as a final point or a beginning point. They repeat a lot throughout these two chapters that the rhizome has no beginning or end. The rhizome is in the middle. The rhizome doesn't have an origin. They're not interested in origins. In the introduction to the other book, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Foucault writes of them, the questions that are less concerned with why, this or that, than with how to proceed. They don't want the final explanation, they don't care. The final explanation is always returning to the final essence, the final origin, the original origin is always God, if you need to explain things to the end. But they are not interested in that. They think that you can reach creativity and freedom only if you concentrate on how things happen, not why they happen. So they abandon the topic of the rest of this research. Any other idea? I've been talking much more than I wanted. I don't know if generally your seminars are more of a lecture-like or interact more.
Yes, they are. You can't get a word in.
Doing just that.
Totally as much as no Then I concentrate on another word, the word assemblage. All in English translation of these go for assemblage. Something that comes together, exists together. A number of things that are together. That's what we call an assemblage. And actually, it is a technical term in art, from Dada to the Surrealism, sometimes in some post-war art. Since they need to describe which technique was used. It wasn't all in canvas, it was a funny patching together of things, assemblage. Now, this doesn't give the full extent of what we've been talking about, because it sounds rather static. You have assembled it, it's a past tense, assembled it, and there it is, it's an assemblage. It's a noun that defines an object, it doesn't move any longer. Even if it is an art piece. Now, there is an interesting quote regarding this by Lawrence Binger, who said once, every piece of art is interactive. What's this point of participatory art that has come up now? You always participate with the art you're going to see, even if it is the most original painting, otherwise you might as well not look at it. So this translation, the assemblage here is, I don't know why the translator chose these, because the original word literally means agency, action. And indeed, you have three words that are recurring in Deleuze and Guattari. Assemblage sometimes, agency and actioning. And I find that keeping this in mind is quite interesting, because if you think of agency and action, it means that not only things are coming together, or better, coexisting for a period of time, But that coexistence becomes active. We are not simply in a room together this afternoon because we're waiting for the train. We don't speak to each other and we spend some time here. Something is happening. It is true that I am a bit more active than you are. But nevertheless, I mean, probably if, like with Johnny, you see throughout the year, more of an interaction might happen, or more of a tension might arise and develop in the mind. If we did not have an hierarchical solution like now, where there is somebody who gives you some sort of information and you listen, but we would join here on an equal level, maybe it wouldn't last. If it did last, something will come out of it, because the very fact that it will last means that there is something that keeps us here to talk about something or to do something. Whether it is, it doesn't matter what it is. But. So the assemblage gains agency or active. It becomes active, productive, generative. I believe it is an important point to keep in mind in this translation, and in the whole idea of the work that they're putting forward. Because otherwise, as you were saying before, when you said, oh, the rhizome is not the idea. The idea is still a static bit. And then you went on, you thought while you were saying it, you said, oh, it moves and it keeps evolving. And there is a risk in this concept of assemblage to close it down a bit too much. While what is happening in these rhythms that start moving from, or they're moving, and then they take up rhythm, they gain weight, then they meet with something else, is that they create dimensions, then they create a place, then they create meaning. Indeed, quoting Paul Klee, he speaks of a great point as a black hole, something that has no meaning, it's in point of known space in the painting. It's the most neutral possible. And and they say that the great point starts out as non-localizing, non-dimensional chaos. And I think that this idea of non-dimensional chaos is very interesting, because chaos, the infinite, where everything is possible but nothing is yet actualized, has no dimension. It's undetermined. There is complete fog. Not complete darkness, not complete light. It's not meaningful. It doesn't, you don't even notice it's there because it's not meaningful. It's not. Is it like in a black hole, you don't see a black hole. All the light that goes into a black hole never comes out, so you don't have information from it. This is why they mention it like that. But as soon as something starts vibrating and picking up a rhythm, gains dimensions, gains shape, reflects light, and there you have information is coming back to you. There is some sort of interaction, some sort of meaning, some sort of relationship gets installed.
Can I ask?
Sure.
Is this great point like non-dimensional and dimensional as well? Or is it one of these two things, or is both of them?
In the way it is proposed here, is non-dimensional. He's outside the event.
But then it comes in the picture, this great point, and organize Zepke.
We should read the old text of Klee to understand exactly how he means it, because here they're just lifting the idea of great point.
It says the great point because I read that.
Yeah. Page 344 if you want.
3 what?
Page 344, halfway through exactly. And let's see if I can find the beginning of the... Okay, I can read from the beginning of the paragraph. These are 3 non-successive moments of an evolution. The 3 aspects of a single thing, the refrain. They are found in Tales, in the Reader as well. The refrain has 3 aspects. They are simultaneous or mixed. And then Paul Klee presents these three aspects in their interlinkage in the most profound way. He calls the black hole a grey point for pictorial reasons. The grey point starts out as non-localizable, non-dimensional chaos, the force of chaos, a tangled bundle of aberrant lines. And then the point jumps over itself and radiates a dimensional space with horizontal layers, vertical cross-sections, unwritten customary lines, a Walter Russell interior force. This force also appears a more relaxed space. And then they say again, the grey point, black hole, has thus jumped from one state to another, and no longer represents chaos, but the abode of home. Finally, the point launches out of itself, impelled by wandering centrifugal forces that fan out of the sphere of the cosmos. One tries convulsively to fly from the Earth, but at the following level one actually rises above it, powered by centrifugal forces that triumph over gravity. Is this what I'm going to do? It's not that the great point both doesn't have dimension and has dimension at the same time. But that as long as it's a great point, simply you don't notice it. It's beyond perception. But then at a certain point something else happens and it jumps over itself, you radiate dimension. It's Big Bang kind of thing. That energy goes down to such a point of density that then it explodes again. And then when it's going down into a black hole, it is absorbing everything and doesn't let anything out. Indeed, they use the word radiating, do they? Yes, because that's exactly what happens. The radiation doesn't come out of the black hole, nothing comes out of the black hole. The gravity is too strong, so even light goes out and comes back into it. So you cannot see it. You cannot, let alone touching it. But then when it explodes, then all this condensed energy that has matter that has lost all dimension is just a pop. It is expanded again, extended, and it gains dimensions.
But it's the same thing, or not?
It's a good question for the physicists here. It isn't.
Yeah, that's very...
according to some, you go through a black hole, you get out, and know the universe on the other side. But it's a different set of dimensions altogether. I wouldn't say it is the same thing. In another book, Deleuze speaks of intensity and extension to analyze this concept. And most of it is repetition and difference. And the two are symmetrically reverted. Like it's not only a negative of like in a photograph, but they are also like that. They turn the negative upside down 180 degrees toward the picture, or something like that. So it's like day and night. You cannot have one and the other. Or the other problem that is often in the background of this kind of writing, quantum physics that says that the particle can be either measured in its speed or in its position, but never both at the same time. And that infinitesimal ideal moment where you could see both is that it's impossible. At least physics say you don't have it. You either see one or the other. And this is how there's the same problem here.
But what you're looking is still the same, even if you can get both of them.
I don't know enough science to answer, but I believe science says no. Or better, says it is uncertain. You can precisely say you cannot say.
Probably.
And because science only talks about what is measurable, then in that case it keeps silent. Sorry, you want to say?
I was going to say it's probable.
It's probable.
So you want to draw that probability of things being in a different place. It's probable that this particle is here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only probable.
Until you measure it, yes.
But it could be anywhere else in the universe.
Yes. Then would you think that this idea of probable, or this idea of either individuating the speed or the position, I always think that somehow sums up or is parallel to the final configuration of the matrix responds to this. You don't have it until you have it. But then when you have that one, all the other options are excluded. Should I make these? Yes, but it's big.
It's a decision. Every time you take a decision, you leave something. Take something else.
But precisely because of these, and this is what I was asking before, do you think that these decisions are between an either-or in making art, or what?
Does it go back to the territory thing? So you've got that distance, so you can make that physical judgment. I know that's going back to
No, it's fine.
perhaps older way of looking at it, but it gives you options. If you imagine it as a physical space range, and you've got this meeting happening, and you can select the option that works best at that moment. Or force
But then do you think, here I am moving a bit more in the art of my interpretation, so my more subjective opinion. These options that you mentioned, are, to you, they are already laid out and you can see them all, or?
No, there's probably like a jostling or
So there is a fuzziness in a way.
yeah. Actually, that's used in fuzziness.
Probably.
Yeah. There's a. You could look at one moment and there's something revealing itself. Look away and it's not there. There's something else. All round, up, down. I don't know. I'm making it spatial, but.
I think it's it's all better. Obviously, when you are working or when you are deciding, some options are already present. Sometimes you only have one option available. Sometimes there are few, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes there is already, I want to say, an array of accepted or.
I was going to interject it. Aren't there only a certain number of possibilities because you've already set boundaries?
Yes, in that case, absolutely. Yes.
So,
absolutely.
like, if you're sat there in front of a blank canvas, it's because you decided to sit with a canvas rather than a chisel.
Precisely, it's really good. Yes. So you are narrowing down, and then by multiplying infinitely, there's more variations within it. But you are narrowing down. Yes, absolutely. So once you have decided to paint, you have set yourself in the idea that you're painting, and in the long, wavy pattern of the history of painting. So there however it moves, but you are in that repetition. To add the last bit to this, so we can make it really complicated. They are saying that what repeats itself is actually the difference. What is returning, what keeps coming back and allows this movement to take place is precisely the fact that there is an interruption of difference that is not the same. We don't have a solid, original lump of something that is immutable, and when we can go back there, touch it like in some good science fiction story. This is the center of the universe, the source of all meaning, and I am enlightened, and I go back and say the word. No. Precisely, it's entirely different. It's a regime of elsewhere. It's not even the opposite. It's constantly else, something else. And there is a major difference between the other or the negative and the else. Because the else can be not complemented, but can coexist with the first instance without contradicting it. The other at times is opposite. The negative certainly contradicts it. The else, you can have as many else's as you like. The variations are, so in this instance, the difference is what has come in. You really have differentiated between n possibilities of making, and you have narrowed down to a framing of a canvas. And then you decide if the canvas is going to be cotton, linen, jute, or it is prime, non-prime, wood, maybe not, a painting, but not kind of look, and then oil, acrylic, oil stick. And all these different, and then, okay, oil stick. How is oil stick being used? We want to do it like Richard Serra, who used just big black oil sticks to paint huge black marks to work with the concept of weight next to his stainless steel installations, or I make drawings with it in various colors. You know, you keep it's not a narrowing it down, it's adding more classes of difference until you have one finite instance, which is not the ultimate unit of it. You can still go. It's like particle physics. You dig deeper and deeper, you find more and more and more and more. But that is the plateau you've reached.
I think as well as one of the sort of definitions of collaboration is recognising difference.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way that's what you're doing, rather than doing it with people, you're doing it with materials. So you recognise some sort of difference between yourself and that material.
Oh yeah.
So,
there was actually, speaking of collaboration, a piece of Ryan Gander and Aurélien Fremont 4 or 5 years ago, where they were collaborating, and the material of the work, the topic of the work was collaboration. And in the gallery, they made a floor, like a wooden floor like this one, but the tiles were much smaller, really big. And they started from 2 different corners. Yes, with the same pattern, but for some reason, whether the rhythm they applied, or the fact that the room wasn't straight, or one went faster, I don't know. Anyhow, the pattern didn't match in the end. So I thought it was brilliant, because you could walk on it, and then in the center, diagonally, there was this funny crack going about, because the tiles would arrive there. And because it was an installation on the top of the existing floor, the more people went in and walked on it, the more the center became, lost its order, and then everything started losing its order. In the end, it was again a complete chaos of tiles. So yes, it is a very good idea. Collaboration is working on the difference, on the distance. They do mention distance, indeed, here, somewhere when they speak of territory. Territory is about distances. The distances you have between you as one rhythm and or a peak of one wave in these rhythms, and the other peak, or the other person, or the history of what you're working with, or the other person that is working with you, or the curator that tells you, yes, I like what you did, I don't like what you're doing now, why don't you do that instead, and so forth. But that's actually a very, very good point to make. They even actually speak directly of art. On page 348, this emergence can be called art. That would make the territory a result of art. That's actually why, it's the last point, where we should conclude. If these plateauing of interactions generates meaning, it is meaning. It doesn't represent pre-existing meaning, it generates meaning. Then, the distance that tradition would have had between aesthetics and science, art and science, or art and pragmatic activities that are just meant to make money and do them 9 to 5, is sort of blurred entirely, because everything generates meaning. Every sort of balance is simultaneously the emerging of a meaning. Most people might not think that they are artists, and they would hate the idea of being artists probably, but what they are saying is that even artists and all the artists as we thought they were, there isn't the idea of, oh, I am creative, no. Is the distribution, the relationship that is installed between the person who enters it as an artist and everything else that is creative. This brings us back to the beginning, where they started trying to unmake and take apart the notion of a concept, or the notion of an individual as a solid concept. It's the relationship, is the rhythm of exchange, the balance of all the things that are participating into it. Don't take it badly. They are not saying artists are both nothing, the creativity is somewhere else. Well, one of the vectors, and again, the plateauing is the time of enjoying that thing. So let's keep doing it. But they are it changes radically the notion of what aesthetics mean. And the fact that aesthetic is supposed to refer to the senses and the sensual and perception, what comes to the surface and the threshold of the senses. Art belongs to that environment. So already, to some, aesthetics cannot speak of conceptual art, and conceptual art cannot be related. There was a problem already when that started, and all the different ways of working that exist now, which involve media, communication, other things, don't enter directly in aesthetics. A while ago, someone told me, you cannot teach in an art school because I was at the time teaching in the media department. I said, why not? I mean, what's the difference? Whatever you lay your hands on can be used artistically. And they didn't see that. Like, to them, art was aesthetic, art was essential, the tangible materials, and media instead was this thing that flows through channels. And the two things didn't match. They couldn't be brought together. If you instead take it as Deleuze and Guattari are proposing it, it isn't absolutely. Whatever holds together for long enough to become meaningful, then there is an emergence, there is meaning there. And so everything is at the same time epistemological as it is aesthetic. So it creates meaning, dimensions, its own laws, and essentiality, and potentially aesthetic pleasure as we understand it in artistic terms. Seems skeptical of me. So I will leave it here, unless you have, I hope you have at least one more question or comment. It was very confused, did it help? Went somewhere for you, resonate with what you're working, the way you're working?
It really helped actually that you kept relating it to artwork. That we're all practitioners, and when you keep relating, this can sometimes be too abstract, and things you read can be too abstract, but that helped.
Well, because I keep foot in both shoes. I am an artist, and now I'm studying, so I didn't notice but this is why I like this work particularly, because it is far easier to relate it to artistic examples.
That's the thing, with camps or whoever, like they just seem too removed from everyday life, and I know that they've been accused of that, haven't they? That sort of way of thinking.
Well, it was a way of
or at the time, it was.
According to what Deleuze and Guattari say, that was inevitable, because they were thinking about the very program was to articulate a discourse of reality, not a practice. And so much that Kant, which could be considered the beginning of the modern structure of his, divides. There is a critique of purism, a critique of practicalism, and a critique of judgment, which involves aesthetic and judgment in terms of how to judge what is beautiful and why we judge something beautiful. The three are three different books, separated, and the three different disciplines. And it reflects the notion of a background and with material, and then a thought that flows above it. While at least in art, it is certainly not like that. I don't think it's like that in any case, but you cannot think and then do. In some cases, you've got to put some distance, yes, but the process is one. And the thought is as sensual as the material, and vice versa. The material is as theoretical or as rigorous with laws as the thought would be. I think. And if with these, you can. To me, it's something that gives freedom to the process of work, rather than closing it down with too much abstract notions around it. But it's also because you got to write an essay about it.
It helps with a notion of Deleuze has got this idea of image, and image being a slice of reality, and that then being connected with the image being connected with every part of the cosmos, really. So it's helped in
but it works on that you mean the two books on cinema? Or?
Yeah.
Yes, because the two books on cinema come after these,
Yeah.
in the mid-80s. The one, especially one that speaks of the image as a crystallization of something, if I remember.
Yeah.
And it is almost like a photograph of this moment. When whatever is moving holds together, is cohesive, and reaches a plateau critical state, and as they call it, a plane of consistency, where consistency generally is understood as being, stick to your ideas, something that makes sense. But what they are saying here is that something really coexists, stays together and finds its own laws for staying together. And you stamp it out, and you have a map of it or an image of it. That's the image I'm referring to. So that's what interpreted and put down by now. So that's why it is a slice of time, because this cohesion or game of finding planes of consistency, it's continuous. It's a continuous flow. That is not discrete. It doesn't happen in steps. It's a flow. If you remember earlier, I was saying that there are lines that move at different speeds in a horizon. Something is developing very, very fast. Something is developing much slower. In the history of the West, which lasts some 3,000 years, our life, about 80 or so, is only much shorter. Or either you can decide if it flows faster or it is shorter, whatever, the other one flows slower or much longer. But the history of the West in geological terms is again a very short segment in front of the history of the planet. So things keep moving. There aren't points. It's like a continuous nuance that flows in and out or around, whatever. But you can, anytime, any moment, take a stamp of it. Actually, taking a stamp is making time, because you mark a moment and then you can measure the difference against it. That's it.
That's right.
So that works also very much for photography, because it's reversed. There is a book there, The Art of Interruption, about photography. And it is indeed interrupting the flow, but it's making time by interrupting the flow, not interrupting time. It's not preserving time as lay understanding of photography would be. It's the opposite, is making time. Because you frame something and preserve it. As Susan Sontag once wrote about photography, that it is not the art of interruption, but the art of bringing into attention. We could link into that. If you make time by stamping any given instance of this flow of things, then and that's then bringing into attention, and by that then you fix something. Oh, look, in the 50s, these were the freaks on the east coast of America, photography. And promise next time I'm up over, I come to see your students.
Thank you.